America is a nation that can be defined in a single word.
The cities, that's the trend. And our cities
can be noisy and messy and complicated. We have our own opinions. Each of us has deeply held beliefs.
That is true.
Read my lips.
There's no black America. There's no white America. There is just America.
Cities like San Francisco,
New York City,
Los Angeles.
It's embarrassing to us as a nation. All over the world, they're talking about Chicago.
So diversity is really, really good.
They've been run very poorly, these cities, whether it's Seattle, where we were getting ready to go in and they decided to go in, and that's good. Minneapolis.
Washington, D.C.
Boston.
Miami.
Philadelphia.
It's still early, but things are looking awful.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger. We made the city freer. And we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.
Sometimes it may be good, sometimes it may be shit.
And who might you be to judge us, huh? You're not even American. Well, precisely, that way I'm less biased. Is that blood on your hands? It's cranberry juice, of course. Washington is obviously filled with honorable people. You know all about them types of people, Mrs. Wall Street. Just take it easy, y'all. It's barely smoggy today, and let me tell you, you don't want that smoke. Chill out, Hollywood. Nobody's picking a fight with you. Why do you always feel the need to pretend to be so tough all the time? Yeah, maybe all that fuss got in you blind, my man. There's no pretending. All that LA fitness has got into his head. It's the West Coast, you guys. Okay, enough. Here's the top 10 cities in the US and why. Number 10, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, if you haven't watched my video about the top 10 cities in Canada, go watch it. But also, here's a reminder of the criteria I used for that video and I'm also using for this video. Cities are judged based on 6 categories, namely affordability, weather, geography, walkability and cycling, public transit, and culture. In the case of Minneapolis, it has the best affordability score of this list at 5.089. This score is calculated by taking the median household income for that metropolitan area and dividing it by the average rent in a core city based off Numbeo data, and then further divide it by 10 to get a score on 10. Obviously, this is a simplistic way to determine the cost of living for an area, but it gives us a general idea, which is all I'm looking for really. Now, why is Minneapolis more affordable than the rest of the country? Well, they simply have a high housing supply, which has kept rents at a lower level. In terms of weather, Minneapolis also ranks decently, middle of the pack even, with a score of 7.27. You might think that's high for a cold place like Minneapolis, but that's because I'm not taking into account temperatures. Listen, if you live in a colder area like Canada or the northern US, you'll get acclimated to the cold, just wear a coat. And if you live in a hot area like Florida or Arizona, you get acclimated to the heat. You get used to it, so I can't judge one more negatively than the other, as some people might prefer the cold and others might prefer the heat. So this weather score, if you multiply it by 10, actually gives us a percentage of how much of the year is going to objectively have nice weather. It's calculated by taking all the expected rainy days and half of the expected snowy days and subtracting them from a whole year. As I've explained in a Canadian video, snowy days are not as annoying as rainy days because if it snows, you can still go outside and do things like walking or any winter sports. Plus it can be beautiful, you know? So yeah, Minneapolis, lots of snow, not that much rain, decent weather. Then we have geography. I'll give you 2 examples to understand this category. The first is Vancouver in Canada, which I gave a score of 10 out of 10 for its geography. Why? Well, it has a natural harbor, rivers, the ocean, beaches, mountains all around, nice views everywhere, and it just has a unique geography. Now on the other end of the spectrum, you have a city that is not on this list but almost made the list, and that is Atlanta. Atlanta would have a score of 0 out of 10 for geography. Why? Well, it is completely flat. It has no bodies of water around, no lake, no river, no sea. You see my point. There's absolutely nothing interesting about Atlanta's geography. Nothing. Hence a score of 0. In the case of Minneapolis, I give it a geography score of 2 out of 10 because it is extremely flat and unremarkable, aside from the 2 major rivers going through it, the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers. Moreover, Minneapolis is not that walkable or cycling friendly. Its downtown, whether you're in Minneapolis proper or St. Paul, are surrounded by highways, and there are in fact a ridiculous amount of them for a metropolitan area of that size. The Twin Cities are extremely car-centric, so there's not really any walkable neighborhood, but you do have some cycling infrastructure, even though it's minimal and it has some badly designed ugly intersections mixing with cars. As such, Minneapolis gets a walkability cycling score of 2 out of 10. Now in terms of public transit, following a simple point system, if a city has a bike sharing system, it gets 1 point. If it has a bus system, it gets 2 points. If it has a BRT or light rail, commuter rail, anything in between a bus and a rail metro system, it gets 2 points. Finally, if it has a metro system, it gets from 1 to 5 points depending on the quality and reach of this metro system. Minneapolis used to have a bike sharing system, but it was unfortunately discontinued in 2022. It has a bus system as well as BRT lines and 2 light rail lines, giving it a Jersey score of 4 out of 10. The last category is culture, and American cities generally score well in that regard. We're talking about whether a city has prominent landmarks, festivals, unique architecture, cuisine, sports teams, do global pop stars tend to go on tour there? Does it host a yearly event like, say, the Indy 500 or the Cincinnati Open tennis tournament? You know, that type of thing. When it comes to culture, Minneapolis is average. It doesn't have anything unique, but it does have major sports teams, and it is relevant enough to attract musicians to go on tour there. So I gave it a culture score of 6 out of 10. Overall, Minneapolis has an average score of 4.393 out of 10. Number 9. Miami, Florida. Miami is the second least affordable city on this list. Its affordability score is at 2.01, meaning you'll likely have to spend a lot of your income on housing if you want to live in the city, or well, you'll have to live somewhere in the suburbs far away. It also has the second worst weather on this list, despite what you might think. This is because it just rains a lot. After all, it's a tropical climate. But Miami has okay geography. While it's very flat, there's the ocean and the beach, the Miami River, and the Everglades, so I gave it a geography score of 4 out of 10. In terms of walkability and cycling, Miami sucks and gets a score of 1 out of 10. It's just not a walkable city. You absolutely need a car to go around anywhere in Florida, and Miami is no exception. For public transit, Miami does have a bike sharing system, as well as a bus system and a light rail, giving it a score of 5 out of 10. Where Miami scores very high, however, is culture. Miami has a 9 out of 10 culture. It has a unique architecture called Miami Modern, or MIMO for short, major sports teams, it hosts a yearly Formula One race, the Miami Grand Prix, as well as the Miami Open, a major tennis tournament on both the ATP and WTA tours. And the city is always on people's tour days. It's Miami. It's a party town. And that gives it an average score of 5.525 out of 10, just ahead of Minneapolis, mainly due to that last category of culture. Number 8, Seattle, Washington. Seattle has a rent income score, so an affordability score of 3.584, which sounds bad compared to Minneapolis because, well, it is, but is actually the third best on this list, which means American cities really don't do well when it comes to affordability for its own residents. While Miami has the second worst weather, Seattle has the worst weather of any city on this list for the exact same reason: rain. With a score of 5.78, that means Seattle has nice weather 57.8% of the time. It's naturally a very similar score to nearby Canadian cities like Victoria and Vancouver, although Vancouver has it worse. Pacific Northwest, innit? Thankfully, Seattle has great geography with a score of 6 out of 10, owing to its natural harbor, lakes, and being near important mountains like Mount Rainier. Unfortunately, the city is far from being very walkable or cycling friendly, but it's still more walkable than the Twin Cities, so I give it a score of 3 out of 10. Seattle doesn't have great public transit for a city of that size. It used to have a bike sharing system, but that was discontinued, while it nowadays only has a bus system and a light rail to its name, giving it a score of 4 out of 10. It's also kind of sad considering how nearby Vancouver in Canada, which is a lot smaller, has much better public transit and bike infrastructure. Gotta do better there, Seattle. Finally, in terms of culture, Seattle is very similar to Minneapolis. It has major sports teams, attracts big names for concerts, but ultimately lacks something unique or super recognizable. So I gave it a score of 6 out of 10. Maybe you live there, maybe you think that's harsh and Seattle has more to offer, but it doesn't really matter. I could give Seattle a culture score of 9 out of 10, and it would still rank number 8 overall. So that gives it an average score of 4.894 out of 10. Number 7, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Maybe one of the most underrated cities in the US, Philly is the second most affordable city on this list after Minneapolis, with a rent income score of 4.073, which is very similar to Ottawa in Canada. Now, when it comes to weather, Philly is kind of average, with a score of 6.85, which is very typically northeast. It's by the coast, so it kind of rains a lot, but not that much, and it snows a little bit, but it's usually sunny, and that's the main point. Philly does have okay geography, being located at the confluence of the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers, but it is otherwise super flat and not by the ocean. With that in mind, I gave it a geography score of 2 out of 10, 1 point for each river. Thankfully, it's a relatively walkable city and fairly cycling friendly, owing to it being one of the oldest planned cities on the continent. As such, I give it a score of 6 out of 10 for that category. Regarding public transit, Philly has a bike sharing system, a bus network, a tramway network, an extensive and very practical commuter rail system, as well as a metro system. However, its metro system is dog shit, having used it before, so I can't give it higher score than 1 for its metro, and a total transit score of 6 out of 10. Finally, Philly has great culture, a lot more so than Seattle and Minneapolis, but slightly less than Miami. It has unique architecture, landmarks, and all the sports teams you'd need, and attracts all the global pop stars, but it doesn't have any prominent yearly events, so I'm docking a point and giving it an 8 out of 10 for culture. Overall, Philadelphia has an average score of 5.487, greatly helped by its affordability and culture, while hindered by its poor and generic geography. Number 6, Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Boston isn't really affordable, with a score of 2.9, which ranks it lower than all the previously mentioned cities except Miami, and firmly in the bottom half. Boston has basically the same weather as Philly and every other northeast city, with a score of 6.8. It's not amazing, but it's not that bad either. Now, Boston's geography is quite unique, being a coastal city with natural harbors and beaches, as well as the Charles and Mystic rivers flowing through, but once again it's extremely flat, so I give it a score of 4 out of 10. In terms of walkability and cycling, it is fairly walkable depending on neighborhood, quite similarly to Philadelphia, although slightly better but not by much, so I gave it a score of 6.5 out of 10. Now, Boston has one of the best public transit systems in the US. It has a bike sharing network called Blue Bikes. It has buses, light rail, commuter rail, and a metro system. Its metro is decent, but it could be better for a city of that size, so I give the city a transit score of 8 out of 10 overall. Once again, Boston is quite similar to Philly, even in terms of culture. They're both cities from the colonial era with a lot of history, landmarks, historic districts, and they have all the sports teams you'd want, as well as unique architecture and cuisine. Boston also has a singular identity as a city, with its own distinct accent and vibe associated with it. So it gets the same score of 8 out of 10 for culture. Overall, Boston ends up with an average score of 6.033, somewhat better than Philly due to its geography, but very similar otherwise. Number 5, Washington, D.C. To start off, and this might be surprising, but DC has a similar affordability as Seattle, with a rent income score of 3.4, which makes it in between Philly and Boston. And like its other northeast neighbors, it has a weather score of 6.88, just slightly better than Philly, being just a bit further south, And once again, like Philly, it is flat with two rivers, the Potomac and the Anacostia, which gives it a geography score of 2 out of 10. Where DC stands out is when it comes to walkability and cycling. The federal capital is very walkable, but that's only true in confines of the District of Columbia, where you can easily live without a car. However, once you're in Virginia or Maryland, in DC's suburbia, you're in some of the most car-centric towns America has to offer. And DC has average bike infrastructure and needs to do a lot better in that aspect. Like, what is this crap? Anyway, I'm giving it best a score of 7 out of 10 for walkability and cycling. Like Boston, DC has one of the best public transit systems in the US, with a bike sharing system called Capital Bike Share, buses, commuter rail, and an extensive metro system. So like Boston, I'm giving it a transit score of 8 out of 10. Finally, DC is home to countless museums, historic and important landmarks, has a unique architecture, as well as major sports teams, yearly events like the Washington Open in tennis, and attracts most pop stars for concerts and tours. As such, I give it a 9 out of 10 for culture. Overall, DC is ever so slightly ahead of Boston with an average score of 6.047. Number 4. Los Angeles, California. LA is a city I personally despise, but like for the Canadian list, I'm trying to make these as objective as possible. With a rent income score of 2.72, LA is among the least affordable cities on this list. In fact, only Miami and New York City are worse. But the City of Angels outshines everyone when it comes to one thing: the weather. With a score of 9.07, it's no wonder the movie industry relocated to Hollywood from NYC. Not only that, but LA's geography is also the second best in the country. I'm talking about mountains, the ocean, beaches, the relatively flat land for construction, and the LA and Ballona rivers, which, yes, aren't real rivers, more like concrete canals and had the time dry and whatnot, but, you know, it's still something. So, LA has a geography score of 8 out of 10. If it had real rivers and no drought issues, then it might have gotten a 10, but it doesn't, so... We move on to walkability and cycling. Obviously, LA is one of the least walkable cities in America, but it has crazy cycling potential due to its climate and wide roads. Unfortunately, there is no strong movement to transform LA into the biking utopia it could be and should be. So for now, it has a walkability and cycling score of 1 out of 10. Womp womp womp. Regarding public transit, LA has a bike sharing system called Metro Bike Share. It has buses as well as commuter and light rail, and a metro system. That metro system, or at least the metro parts of their rail system, comprises 2 lines, D and B, which only serves downtown LA and North Hollywood. So it's pretty shitty. So I'm giving it a minimum score of 6 out of 10. Finally, when it comes to culture, LA has few rivals. Obviously, I'm giving it a 10 out of 10 for culture. It's Los Angeles. You've got Hollywood, not just for movies but also music, the Southern California vibes, landmarks, all the sports teams, multiple times over, and you've even got Disneyland, so yeah. Overall, LA has an average score of 6.132, just slightly ahead of Boston and DC. Number 3. Chicago, Illinois. I know what you're thinking. Chicago has a bad reputation, you know? Chirac, all the murders, yada yada. I don't care. I'm not American. I've been to Chicago. It's not dangerous at all. At least not more dangerous than any other city in the US. In fact, there are higher rates of crimes in Dallas, Memphis, Nashville, and DC apparently. It's just that there's a high crime density in certain neighborhoods of Chicago, so I guess the solution is to just avoid those areas, right? Anyway, Chicago is not as affordable as I initially thought it'd be, with a rent income score of 2.88. It's even less affordable than Boston, Seattle, and DC. Hell, Toronto is more affordable than Chicago. Chicago's weather score is 6.91, making it slightly better than DC's, but otherwise extremely similar to its northeast counterparts. In terms of geography, Chicago is kind of average. It's obviously very flat, but it has beaches and Lake Michigan, as well as the Chicago River, so I give it a score of 4 out of 10. Regarding walkability and cycling, Chicago is very similar to DC, with a score of 7 out of 10. Many neighborhoods are very walkable, and the cycling infrastructure is being expanded rapidly in recent years, so they're definitely in the right track. However, Chicagoland is one of the most sprawled out metropolitan areas in the United States, so I can't give it a higher score than that, even if you can definitely live without a car in Chicago proper. Now, when it comes to public transit, Chicago has a very good network of bus lines, commuter rail, bike share, and a metro system, famous for being partially elevated. However, Chicago's metro system isn't as extensive and practical as New York City's, or cities of the same size in Europe or Asia, so I can only give it a score of 8 out of 10, which is still amazing for North America. Finally, Chicago has 9 out of 10 culture. Like Miami and DC, Chicago has unique architecture, major landmarks, unique cuisine like its signature deep dish pizza. It has all the sports teams, attracts all the artists on tour, and has major festivals and museums. And it's also one of the most recognizable cities in the world. So overall, Chicago has an average score of 6.298, making it marginally better than LA, DC, and Boston. Number 2, San Francisco, California. While making this list, I did not expect SF to be that high, mainly due to knowing how expensive that city is. As it turns out, SF is definitely not affordable. But with a rent income score of 3.21, it's more affordable than Boston, Chicago, LA, Miami, and NYC. It's even more affordable than Toronto, which really surprised me. But I think it just comes down to the Bay Area having the highest median income of any region in the US, similar to how Calgary and Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, are a lot more affordable than, say, Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal, because median income in Alberta is higher. San Francisco weather is notoriously good, with its own foggy microclimate, where it's neither too hot nor too cold. But I'm not judging climate, I'm judging sunlight. And SF has the second best weather score on this list after LA, with a score of 8.05. You know, maybe the Golden Gate Bridge will be hidden in the fog, but it'd likely be sunny everywhere else. SF does have a perfect geography score of 10 out of 10, owing to its unique location nested between the San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. It's hilly, it has mountains all around, as well as beaches, lakes, islands, you name it. So if you want to go hiking, you want to do whatever, you can go do it. San Francisco has amazing geography. But when it comes to walkability and cycling, SF is pretty much like its eastern counterparts in DC or Chicago, in that the city proper is very walkable, but once you get out of there, not so much. Cycling wise also it's decent, but could be better. So overall, I give it a score of 7 out of 10. Now, here's where SF kinda lose points, and it's public transit. It has a bike sharing system, buses, light rail with Muni, and commuter rail with Caltrain, but BART isn't great. Yes, it's a metro, sort of, but it just doesn't go where you need it to go, besides that one central line along Market Street. Anyway, call me Sideshow Bob because I'm not a fan of BART, and so I give SF a transit score of 7 out of 10. Once again, we end up with the last category, culture. Culturally speaking, San Francisco and the Bay Area as a whole also has unique architecture, landmarks, museums, all the sports teams, and artists almost always go on tour there. So I also give it a 9 out of 10. Overall, San Francisco is safely the second best city in America, with an average score of 7.377, well ahead of Chicago and other cities below. Number 1. New York City, New York. It's no surprise that NYC ends up first on this list. We're talking about possibly the most famous city in the world, and yet it's the least affordable city on this list with a rent income score of 1.794. It also has one of the lowest weather score at 6.72, even if it is very similar to other Northeast cities. NYC also has above average geography, owing to its location on islands by the ocean and at the estuary of the Hudson River. Obviously, being mainly flat on Manhattan, Staten, and Long Island, the only real sort of prominent elevation changes would be the Brooklyn Heights as well as the New Jersey Palisades, which wouldn't really change anything. But it does have natural beaches, so I'm giving New York a geography score of 6 out of 10. The Big Apple is obviously the most walkable and cycling-friendly city in the US, and among the best in the world as well in that regard. You obviously do not need a car to live there. especially New York City proper, as well as neighboring cities like Hoboken. Cycling infrastructure is extensive, with numerous bike paths all over, so I'm giving it a score of 10 out of 10. Same logic for public transit. NYC has a bike sharing system, buses, commuter rail, and a subway system that runs 24 hours a day and goes everywhere in the city. Easily another 10 out of 10 for transit this time. And for culture, NYC is a cultural juggernaut. No city in America can rival it, besides maybe LA. So it's here again an easy 10 out of 10. NYC has its own subcultures, its own food, its own dialects, a plethora of sports teams, yearly major events like the US Open, countless landmarks and museums, yada yada. So overall, New York City has an average score of 7.419, losing a lot of points due to affordability. Interestingly enough, that makes it only marginally better than San Francisco, with Californian Jewel besting the entire city in terms of affordability, weather, and geography, but with NYC beating it when it comes to walkability, transit, and culture. To recap, we have in order: number 10, Minneapolis; number 9, Miami; number 8, Seattle; number 7, Philadelphia; number 6, Boston; number 5, Washington, D.C.; number 4, Los Angeles; number 3, Chicago; number 2, San Francisco; and number 1, New York City. Here's how these 10 cities rank within the specific categories, so if you favor one category or another, you can weight in the scores. Also, I should mention that cities like Denver, Portland, or Atlanta just missed out on making the list, with Denver being particularly close to make the cut over Minneapolis. Now, just for fun, let's compare how these US cities would rank in North America as a whole in a top 20. For that purpose, I'm including Canada and selected cities in Mexico. I plan on doing a separate video for Mexican cities, but as it turns out, cities in Mexico are extremely unaffordable for their own residents, and barely any of them have public transit, so their scores were often pretty low. Tuxtla in Chiapas was actually a big surprise, with a pretty decent score overall despite having 0 for public transit. Besides Tuxtla, there are the usual suspects of Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. At the top, Montreal outranks San Francisco and New York City only because it's more affordable than New York, and it has better transit than SF. If we put all 3 cities at the same affordability level and the same public transit score, San Francisco would actually be the clear winner, followed by Montreal and then New York in third place. That means, Bay Area residents, you know what to work on to get that top spot. So, on that note,